In other news tonight, we are seeing signs that the country's food supply chain is under significant stress. Here are two scenes. These are the enormous lines for the LA Regional Food Bank over the weekend, with cars stretching for miles. We've seen this kind of scene play out all over the country. People are desperate for food. They're having trouble feeding their families, their kids particularly. And here's another scene. This is what some dairy farmers are doing, dumping out thousands of gallons of fresh milk every day. Other farmers are destroying crops outright, plowing, for instance, ripe vegetables right back into the ground. Because with restaurants, schools, and hotels and other things closed, farmers that are part of the commercial food supply chain just don't have anywhere to sell their products. Also, the frontline workers, those that are keeping the food chain going, they are clearly at tremendous risk. They're still in the fields picking produce with minimal to no protection, particularly immigrants without papers. This is what it looks like inside a pork processing plant. People working there have to stand shoulder to shoulder. Yesterday, one of the largest plants in the country shut down in South Dakota indefinitely after nearly 300 employees tested positive for coronavirus. That's nearly a third of the cases in the entire state. The food supply chain is one of those things that the vast majority of us, I think, tend to take for granted. We go to a restaurant or a grocery store or a fast food chain and the food is just there. But this crisis is putting stress on all parts of it from every angle. Last week, we brought you an interesting story about our toilet paper supply. And that reporting showed that the reason there's a shortage of toilet paper at stores is only really partly because people are hoarding this stuff. It's more because the industry is split into two markets. There's a commercial one and a consumer one. And everyone at home is now using the consumer product. And the commercial one, the one that's usually given to businesses and campuses and office buildings, cannot be easily made available for residential use. Well, guess what? It turns out the food supply chain is structured in a similar way. While grocery stores are having a hard time keeping things in stock, there is an entire food chain designed to sell bulk food to fast food stores and restaurants that is essentially being left to rot. And that is because a supply chain, as one dairy industry advocate explains, is tough to just switch around.
Because oftentimes the packaging and the size of the product that's delivered to grocery stores or distributed through those avenues of food service are much larger and not necessarily for family use.
This weekend, Wall Street Journal's agriculture reporter Jesse Newman wrote about coronavirus's impact on our food supply chain, specifically why farmers are dumping milk and breaking eggs in the middle of a pandemic. Jesse Newman joins me now. And Jesse, you've been doing great reporting on this that I've been following avidly. Talk to me a little bit about this conundrum here, the paradox of these sort of two supply chains and the fact that one of them is so in sort of disuse at this strange moment that there's tons of food being produced with nowhere to go.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really strange situation that farmers and food producers find themselves in. You know, in the past few months since all of this began, we've seen just massive upheaval in the food supply chain. And, you know, at the beginning, we saw consumers flocking to grocery stores and clearing shelves of just about every product in anticipation of weeks and months at home. And so we started looking at, well, what is the strength of this food supply chain? And early on, we learned that there was plenty of food in the country. So our cold storage warehouses were full of products like chicken and pork, and there was plenty of fresh produce on farms and on orchards, and plenty of grain in grain bins. But it's become clear over time that this huge shift was needed to take place in order to get that food to consumers. So as restaurants closed, hotels and school cafeterias, all of that food that was destined for those outlets needed to be shifted to grocery stores. And as it turns out, that's tough to do.
Right. So you've got the situation where the food is there, but they don't have the relationships, the distributors, the networks that are sort of pre-established to get them into major grocery chains. So you've got that sort of part of it wilting. Is the grocery avenue able to keep up right now? I mean, is the sort of residential household use food supply chain functioning essentially?
So grocers, like everyone in the food supply chain, are scrambling to keep up. And the challenge really is converting some of these products from restaurants into the grocery chain. So, for example, we wrote about dairies that are dumping milk and chicken companies that are breaking eggs, that are growing chickens for meat. And there is just too much food that can't make it into the grocery channel, as you say, because some of those relationships don't exist. And it's also a question of varieties of food and packaging and sizes. So, for example,
Right.
Vegetable producer told me that they've got all this conventional spinach that they grow for use in restaurants. Well, as it turns out, shoppers mostly prefer organic spinach. And so there just isn't a home for vast quantities of the conventional spinach that they grow. And in the case of dairy, a good example is cheese. So on a dairy farm, which produces, millions of gallons of milk, a lot of that goes into cheese production, and cheesemakers are making, huge packages of shredded cheese that are bound for pizza chains, mozzarella cheese that's going to go on top of pizzas.
Right.
And easily converted into a small 8-ounce zippered bag that a consumer likes to buy at a grocery store. It just takes specialized equipment, and it's very costly to try to shift on a dime.
So the final question here has to do with the workers that are part of this entire chain. I mean, these are people that are, essential services, whether that's the grocery person or a farm worker picking fruit, or those folks we've seen in pork processing plants. I mean, these are all people who are both needed, but also really exposed right now, as the story out of South Dakota shows.
That's right. So farm workers have been deemed essential workers. They are still being encouraged to go to work and pick our fresh fruits and vegetables, or in the case of meat processing plants, workers, we need those workers to produce the products that we all enjoy. And yet farm workers and their advocates are quite concerned about the risks that they face. A lot of workers, as you mentioned, are undocumented. Some are here on seasonal guest worker visas, and their employment is tied to a particular employer. And there are, conditions that persist in this industry that are very concerning, whether it is overcrowded housing, or these workers are being transported to fields in dozens of workers to a bus. They work in close proximity to one another. And so, there's a lot of concern about their health and safety.
All right. Jesse Newman, who's been doing just really excellent reporting on all this, the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much.